This video is about the statistical problem-solving process, which is the process that we're going to go through over and over in this course as we analyze data. So the first step of that process is formulating questions. That's what we'll be talking about today. The second step is collecting data. Sometimes we'll be collecting data ourselves, but a lot of times we'll be looking at data that other people have collected and thinking about sort of what went right and what went wrong and how we can interpret the results. The third step is analyzing data. So that's what people generally think of as statistics, calculating numerical summaries, making graphs, that kind of thing. And the fourth step is interpreting the results. So this really goes back to how the data were collected. So what conclusions can we actually draw based on this data, and what are our limitations? Okay, so we're going to start with formulating a question, and there may actually be multiple questions involved at different stages of the process. So let's say that I had a broad research question about students' background knowledge. What background knowledge do students bring to this class? That's so broad that it's going to be sort of hard to answer, right? Am I going to ask a survey question and am I going to give people a test? How am I going to find that out? So a statistical question narrows it down a little bit. So a statistical question is one that can actually be answered with data. Okay, so let's say my statistical question is what proportion of MSIT 3000 students have taken a statistics class before? That's specific enough that I know how to answer that question. But then to actually collect that data, I need another question. I need a survey question. So this says, have you taken any statistics classes? So notice when it's saying you, this is a question that would actually be written on the survey, right? This is directed to the person who's taking the survey. Also, with survey questions, a lot of times you need to be more specific because it's not just the researchers who's reading it, it's the participants who are actually reading the question. So here I've said, have you taken any statistics classes at the high school or college level, just to make sure everybody's on the same page as they're answering the question. So there's a few different types of statistical questions that you might see. So some of them are about the distribution of one variable. The term distribution just means what values the variable takes and how often it takes these values. So let's say that we're asking the question, what percentage of flyers think you're rude if you recline your seat? So this is a distribution of just one variable. Okay, so this is actually a question about a categorical variable. So this can be a little bit confusing at first because it seems like we have a lot of numbers here, right? We've got counts, we've got percentages, that seems quantitative. But if you think about it, what these numbers are actually telling you is just how many are in each category, right? We've got three categories here, that reclining your seat is not rude at all, somewhat rude, or very rude, and the numbers are just telling us how many are in each of those categories. Another question about the distribution of just one variable, what is the distribution of air times for all flights departing New York City in 2013? Okay, so here we can see that we have a quantitative variable. Airtime is measured in minutes, so for every flight we're recording a quantitative value. So those were questions about the distribution of just one variable. Other statistical questions are about the relationship between two variables. So we usually call those the explanatory variable and the response variable. So if you're thinking about the response variable, I like to think of that as like the outcome that I'm interested in. So whatever it is that I'm ultimately interested in, that's my response variable. Whereas the explanatory, you can think of that as like a predictor. This is something that's helping you predict the outcome, predict the response. So this first question says, is there a relationship between airline carrier and arrival delay? So what you really care about is the delay, right? You want to know if your flight is going to be delayed or not. What you're using to predict that is the airline carrier, right? So this is the explanatory variable. And we can also label these as quantitative or categorical. These are, let's see, the response here is quantitative, the amount of the arrival delay. As we saw in a previous video, that was measured quantitatively. And the airline carrier, that's categorical. Right, so we're categorizing flights based on which airline carrier they were from. The next one, what is the relationship between airtime and distance? So these are both quantitative variables, It's not quite as clear maybe which one is the response and the explanatory. Sometimes it isn't. But I think maybe we're really most interested in how long is this flight going to take. So I would say that this one is probably the response variable. And like we said, that's quantitative. How many minutes is it in the air? And the distance, that's what we're using to predict the airtime. So that's the explanatory variable, and it's also quantitative. The last one here is there a relationship between whether a flyer has children under 18 and whether they think it's rude to bring unruly children on the plane. So I would say probably what we're interested in is whether they think it's rude, right? That's probably the response. And this is going to be categorical, right? We talked about how it was either not rude at all, somewhat rude, or very rude. And what we're using to predict people's attitudes is whether or not the flyer has children themselves. So this would be the explanatory variable, and that